Okay, and let me see if it is actually working.
It gives you details on like Tracy.
Looks like it's actually working, yay, great. All right, so, and once again, I can't get the narrated PowerPoint to pause. I've hit times, so I'll just have to do it this way. I apologize for that. We need to talk about today the meaning and value of work. And one of the things that students often question is, why are we talking? This seems like an HR topic rather than a marketing ethics topic. But one of the things that we've recognized, because marketing is the only fully integrated function of the firm, is that internal marketing is oftentimes just as important as external marketing, in that if we can get employees to do what we call live the brand, it adds value to the firm because it creates more satisfied customers, because at every touch point, those customers are going to experience somebody who really engages in the values and ethics of the corporation. And an example of this is Southwest Airlines. They are a company that really lives the brand. Southwest doesn't pay the most for their A&P mechanics. They don't pay the most for their pilots or their flight attendants, but their employees are enormously brand loyal to them. And as a result, Southwest has been one of the few airlines that has been consistently profitable throughout the airline's corporate history. Most of the other airlines have gone through bankruptcy, a reorganization at least once, and many of the airlines that were huge players, the first, like major world airline, Trans World Airline, is gone broke, right? Or Pan American, I'm sorry, Pan American went broke, quite a while ago, and a lot of the airlines have faced bankruptcy. So, in order to try and encourage employees to live the brand, I think one of the things that we have to think about is, how do we create an ethical workplace? And if you look at sort of the traditional views of work, they are a means and sort of analysis, right? So work is something that we all have to do. Most of us are not born into independently wealthy families, and so we have to have a job. And it's a transactional sort of relationship for a lot of people. There's also, sort of a dichotomy in that there's a glory versus contempt for work. Work can be an expression of our highest human fulfillment, and it can also be enormously difficult and degrading if we don't have just, fair, and humane workplaces. So the challenge is, if we think of this in terms of Hegelian dialectic, on one end of the view is this conventional view that work is something that is hard. It's well, that one's gone. I don't know why people keep putting this back. So work is something that is, necessary. This one's not working either. A whole lot. Probably go through the whole stack here. It's not working either. Oops. And I can't make the basket. This one works. It's a necessary evil. The antithesis is that it can be fulfilling. The human fulfillment model. And somewhere in between is a synthesis which focuses on autonomy. Right? So trying to make the workplace just, fair, and humane. In a book called Habits of the Heart, Robert Bellah and his colleagues talk about 3 different types of workplace that we can have. 3 different types of work that we can engage in. At the bottom level is a job. And a job, we haven't talked about this in here, have we? A job is, I just want to make sure I hadn't gotten ahead. A job is one in which the identity of the person performing the task is largely divorced from the task itself. And so when I was on city council 25 years ago, and I was vice mayor 25 years ago, and I'm vice mayor again 25 years later, we actually employed at that point in time the trash collection. We now outsource that to Waste Connections, which is based in Oklahoma City. It's a private firm, but at the time when I was on city council first 25 years ago, we actually had our own trash trucks, and we actually employed those people. They were city employees. They were eligible for city benefits, including retirement benefits and things like that, which was expensive, which is one of the reasons that city councils after mine decided that they would outsource that. Now, one of these individuals that worked for us in the city was a constituent of mine. He lived in Ward 3. So the city of Guthrie is divided into 3 geographic areas called wards, and each of the city councilmen represent roughly 4,000 people. One of those people that I represented was one of the guys who worked for the city in the trash collection department. And I knew him pretty well because he was in my ward, and I had walked the entire ward and gone and talked to everybody. And if you talk to this gentleman, this is a necessary task, but I don't know anybody who says that it's my goal to be a trash collector at that point in time, because at that point in time, they actually had to go and pick up the trash, right? In the late 1990s, the trash truck came by. It was a 3-man crew that manned the trash truck. So there was a driver, that was the prime job on the crew, and there were 2 guys that rode around on the back of the trash truck, and they would actually pick up the trash cans and dump them into the back of the trash truck and then set them back down, right? That's not the way it works now. They've got these big blue poly carts that come by, and the vehicle picks it up for you and does it. So it's not as bad a job as it was at that time, but so he was one of the ones that rode around on the back. If you asked him and you talked to him, which I did a lot, how he defined himself not by the job that he did. He defined himself in terms of the passions that he had in terms of hobbies like fishing and, spending time with his grandkids and being a husband and a father and all of these other things. And so it was just a job. It was just very transactional. He just did this as a means of providing for his family. And I don't know anybody that says, that's my dream job. Although after I grade student essays sometimes now, I think that maybe I would like that job because it's fairly mindless. You get to ride around in the truck. It's not all that bad of a job anymore. The truck actually picks up the trash and dumps it for you. You don't have to do it yourself. But that's a job. That's something that people, there's not a lot of creative ways of doing this job, right? I mean, you don't want people who are terribly creative picking up the trash because it might not get picked up. And you just need them to follow a route which is predetermined and pick up the trash, right? Necessary job, but not terribly creative. You don't want them getting experimental with things like that, because when things like that happen, things go awry, and that's not good. So that's a job. Lots of people's first jobs are working in fast food. Again, you don't want somebody terribly creative working at McDonald's. I mean, they may be creative in other aspects of their life, but you want them to follow the protocol, right? So a Big Mac at McDonald's is, and everybody should know this, it should come tripping off your tongue, 2 all-beef patty, special sauce, lettuce, cheese, pickles, onions on a sesame seed bun. That's what a Big Mac is. It's going to taste the same in New York City as it does in Guthrie, Oklahoma, or Oklahoma City. I've had Big Macs when I was a foreign exchange student in Germany. They tasted exactly the same way that they did in the United States, because that's the way the Big Mac is made. And that's one of the things that we love about McDonald's, is that it is consistent, right? It's consistently mediocre, but it's consistent. You know what you're going to get, and you don't want somebody that's terribly creative. So that's a job at the lowest level. Then in the middle is a career, and that's what most of you want. The reason that you're here at 9:30 on Tuesday mornings at the University of Central Oklahoma is because you want a career. Now, the first publicly funded institution of higher education, secular institution of higher education, was founded by Thomas Jefferson. It's called the University of Virginia. If you went back in time historically, universities were affiliated with religious institutions. The three original learned professions, anybody want to guess what the three original learned professions were that universities were designed to develop?
The doctor.
The doctor, medicine is one. Yep. So that's the third of the three. The two oldest are, anybody want to guess the other two? So medicine is the third.
Well, if it's like a religious, does it have to do with like seminary?
Yep. Okay. So the first one, the oldest one that most institutions of higher education were developed for, was to transmit knowledge for the clergy, right? They were developed in Western Europe largely by the Roman Catholic Church, and they were developed to train clergy members. The Bible was written in many instances Latin, and so you had to have these people that learned Latin and could say the Mass. The vast majority of people couldn't read or write, and they didn't really understand. The Mass used to be said in Latin. I think even up until Vatican II, the Mass was said in Latin, and it was in Vatican II, I think, if I've got my history correct, that the faith of the Holy See switched to saying the Mass in whatever language it was that the congregation understood, right? But before that, it was said in Latin, so you had to learn Latin, and you had to to be able to read the Bible, and that was important. So that's the oldest. The second oldest then was law, and it was largely canonical law, which the Holy See still has, ecclesiastical courts. So the second oldest profession is the law, and then the third is medicine. So those are the three original professions. So we've now expanded that. So the first publicly funded institution of higher education that was secular, in other words, it was not attached to a church. Now in Western Europe, most of the churches are also part of the state, right? Or they were historically. The state and the church were sort of inseparable in many instances. This is still the case in places like the United Kingdom. The monarch is the defender of the faith and the head of the Church of England in the United Kingdom. And the Church of England is the official church of the United Kingdom, right? So King Charles is the head of that church. He's also the head of state. So in the United States, we were founded as a secular nation. The first secularly publicly funded institution of higher education in the world was the University of Virginia, founded by Thomas Jefferson. And Jefferson's idea in founding the University of Virginia was he wanted to hire the finest scholars from around the world, and he wanted them to come and give lectures that would be open to the public. The public could come, sit in on the lectures, and leave when you felt educated. Now, I ask students every semester when I talk about this, the meaning and value of work, how many of you would do that? How many of you would come to this class at 9:30 on Tuesday mornings and just listen to me yammer at you if you didn't get a piece of paper at the end of this that said, I'm educated, I have a degree, and I suppose everybody in here is a marketing student, and I have these skills that I can then go out and get a job with? How many of you would do that? Anybody? Any takers? No. No one would do that. That was Thomas Jefferson's idea, was that the University of Virginia would be open to everybody. You could come, listen to the lectures, and leave when you felt educated. He didn't want it to be a degree granting institution. That's not what it ended up as, right? Because nobody would do that. Because what you're here for is that piece of paper that says you are educated, you have these skills, and you're going to be able to translate those into adding value for an employee, right? So what you want is not a job, what you want is a career. And this is one in which there is a close connection between the activity that's performed and the identity of the individual that's performing the activity. That's a career. So we generally think of these as being sort of the learned professions. Again, law, medicine, accounting, marketing now has become a profession. We are now elevating the sales profession to professional status, right? By having sales programs and developing academic coursework in these fields that allow you to say, I graduated with a degree in professional selling. This is my shameless plug for the professional sales program. And I can add value to your firm, right? But you have some connection between the activity and your identity. And it's important. And most people want this kind of connection. They want something that allows them to be fulfilled in the activity that we're going to spend the best years of our life doing. The best years of your life, the years when you feel the best, are going to be spent largely 40 hours a week or more doing this activity. And so you want something that provides some kind of level of satisfaction. And this is indicative of when they do surveys of what is it that motivates people at work. Do you have how close towards number one do you think money is for most people? You think it's at the top? You think money is at the top of what most people say is the reason that they choose the career that they choose?
Yes.
You think yes? Sometimes? It's not. In most surveys, it's like 10 or lower on the list of things that people look for in a job, with one exception: salespeople. Salespeople, it's always at the top. And that's pretty understandable, given the fact that sales is the only career that you can go into and basically set your salary. If you want to make more money in sales, what do? Sell more. You can set your salary in sales. If you want to make more money, one of my friends who used to come and talk when I taught the intro to professional sales class, worked for US Foods. And he would tell you, he's like, I decided I wanted 1 year to take my kids to Disneyland, and I wanted to stay at one of the top tier resorts at Disney World, not Disneyland. And I figured out what I had to do to do that. And for 6 months, I needed to sell what it amounted to selling one extra case of meat a week for 6 months in order to be able to he worked for US Foods, sold to restaurants, had to sell one extra case of meat a week. And so that was his goal, was to sell one extra case of meat to convince, restaurants to put specials in that involved steak, and he could pay for his trip to Walt Disney World with his kids. So that's a career. The highest level is a calling. This is an activity in which the self is largely indistinguishable from the job that's being performed. Now, this is the way that I look at the legal profession. When I went to law school and I became a lawyer, one of the things that they tell you in law school is, and one of the things that my professors really emphasized, was that this is a brotherhood, right? The legal profession is a brethren. And you are governed by the rules of professional responsibility as a lawyer 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So the behavior that I have to exhibit is different than other people. There are things that I can't do that other people can do and get away with. And I'm subject to being disciplined by the bar as a lawyer. Even if I'm not your lawyer, you can file a complaint against me as a member of the bar and say, like, this lawyer treated me unfairly. And I could be subject to discipline by the bar, in spite of the fact that I'm not your lawyer, right? Now, it's hard to do, right? But in theory, I am a lawyer 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. I can never escape the rules of professional responsibility which govern that profession. That is a calling. So what is another calling? Well, generally, the clergy is a calling. The priesthood is a calling. You are a priest 100% of the time, right? When you become a Catholic priest, you give up most of the things that other people want in this world. The ability to get married, the ability to make lots of money, the ability to own property, right? Catholic priests, they give all that, they take vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience to God, right? So it's a calling. Most people want a career, and that's what we focus on in here, is given the fact that most people want a career, how do we make these places that we're going to spend a vast majority of our time ethical and places where people engage in living the brand? Well, in order to determine that, we have to look at the terminus ad quem. What is it that we want from these places? So what is the value of work? Well, at sort of a basic level, and if you have just a job, it's wages and benefits, the instruments of the job, right? That's the lowest level. What is it? These wages and benefits that you get, that you're going to negotiate for. And things like health, disability, paid leave, right? Which in the United States, we have some of the lowest amounts of things like this, of any nation on earth. We work more than almost any other nation with one exception, and that's Japan. The amount of time that we have off in this country is really very low compared to lots of other countries, where you have, at least in most other places in Western Europe, you have a month off. When I was a foreign exchange student in Germany, the father of the family that I lived with, he was a superintendent of public instruction, basically, for this little town that I lived in, which was called Zost. And he was constantly off. I mean, he came home in the middle of the day at 11 and stayed until 2, and then went back from 2 to 4:30, and then he was off. And then he decided that he was going to have a nervous breakdown and he needed to go to the spa, which the state paid for. And he went off for a month and a half when I was there to get his psyche better or whatever. And that was all covered, and they didn't have any problems with that. And I was like, does anybody ever work here? Because my family, like my mother owned businesses from the time I was a little kid. My father was an FBI agent. Like, they worked like constantly. He didn't seem to work. So these benefits that are enormously important, and of course wages. But for most of us, what we want, and one of the reasons why is it that I'm a college professor? I could make a lot more money, and I made a lot more money practicing law, being a trademark and copyright attorney. That's what I did. I practiced intellectual property for a publicly traded company. I was pretty good at it. I tried cases to juries that infringed on our trademark, and I made a lot of money doing that. Why is it that I'm here where I don't make as much money? Well, because I want these other things besides just money and benefits. Now, the money and benefits at the University of Central Oklahoma are pretty good. To be a college professor is pretty good. You want to make 6 figures a year and have, the ability to take 3 months off in the summer and not work. You get a month off at Christmas. We just all came back from spring break. Anybody go any place exciting for spring break? Nobody went anywhere. I went to Pagosa Springs for spring break, right? Because I'm a college professor. You all probably had to work. Everybody in here have a job. So you were probably working during spring break. So you got a partial break. I got to go with my family to Pagosa Springs because, I had this nice job as a college professor. But other things are more important to me. Why is it that I do this? Well, as much as I was good at being a intellectual property attorney, a lot of it, once you learned how to file trademarks, it was pretty routine. You did the same thing over and over. I filed trademarks for companies, right? I did the same thing over and over and over again. In lawsuits, you go through the same steps over and over and over again, right? And it was just kind of boring after a while. I mean, it was not terribly intellectually. The title is intellectual property attorney, and you'd think that would be like highly cerebral. But after you sort of figure this out, it's largely about filling out the same paperwork over and over and over again to get a trademark. And then once you get the trademark, if somebody infringes the trademark, it's about filing a lawsuit, which begins with the same thing. You file a complaint in federal court in the district in which you can get service on the defendant, and or if they have sufficient contacts with your district and your home district. It's a sort of about the same thing. So what is it that attracted me to coming back to the university and becoming a college professor? Well, it was a lot of these psychic goods, the ability to be creative. My mother was a very good artist and a very good musician as well. She could play instruments. I mean, she's just very talented. All of my family are like that. They're all also very good athletes. My brother was the only American to get a scholarship on the OSU tennis team the year that he started college. Everyone else was from South America, where they play a lot of tennis, and he was the only kid from the United States, which was pretty impressive. And he was good when he was in high school. He was a ranked player in the Missouri Valley. He was ranked in the top 10 consistently in the Missouri Valley, which is what led him to get the scholarship. I was not good at that. So in order to be creative, what do I have to do? Well, this allows me to have a creative outlet, because fundamentally the way that I engage and think about structuring my course and making it relevant to you is a creative process, right? And that provides me with a lot of satisfaction. So it's these psychic goods like self-worth, achievement, self-esteem, happiness. It's somewhat prestigious when people say, what do you do? And it's the first question people will ask you when they meet you is, what do you do? And why do they ask you that? It's not because they really care. It's because it allows them to, A, place you on the sort of social hierarchy. Americans like to think that we don't have a class system, but we do in this country. And it's largely unlike other countries like Great Britain, where the class system is completely based on where you were born, right? And you will never, in the British system, it doesn't matter what job you have or what profession you go into, you will never, unless you are born into it, achieve the highest levels of class distinction in the United Kingdom. Why is that? Because those are hereditary. How do you become a member of the upper class in Great Britain? You're born into it. You're born into either the monarchy or the aristocracy. Now, you can become, now, they've become more egalitarian over the years. You can become what's called a life peer in Great Britain. Those are all barons or baronesses, and those are titles that are given during the sovereign's birthday. Usually there's 3 times that they give these out, but you're still never really officially a part of the landed gentry, right? That's reserved for the non-royal. At the top of that hierarchy are the non-royal dukes, right? And then below the dukes are the heirs, or the earls, I'm sorry, the earls. So you have dukes and earls, and this whole system of class. In the United States, we have a class system as well. It's largely based on income and what you do, right? Your ability to earn a lot of money and become a wealthy individual. So when you meet people at a cocktail party and they ask what you do, there's some prestige in saying, I'm a college professor at the 3rd largest institution in the state, right? My mother didn't think that. She would tell everybody, she had 2 sons, and she told us when we were growing up that we could be one of 2 things. That was it. You could either be a doctor or a lawyer. And by doctor, she didn't mean PhD. She meant medical doctor. And that was it. That was the only 2 things that she said that we could be. And when I told her I was going to go get a PhD, originally, she told me that she would not pay for another worthless degree, that I could give my car back to her, what she had bought, and she wouldn't pay for my insurance, and I could just move out because I might as well just become a homeless person. She was not gonna stand for that. So I went off to law school and became a lawyer at my mother's insistence. And my brother went off to law school at my mother's insistence and became a lawyer as well. And my mother would tell people, when she'd meet them, she would always say, my son's the lawyers. And I'm like, Mom, I'm a college professor. And she's like, yeah, and he has this PhD too. And I'd be like, I've spent more of my life being a college professor than I have actually engaged in the practice of law. She's like, my son's the lawyers, right? Because that's what she perceived as being higher on the social hierarchy, was to be a lawyer. But these things of self-esteem, when you meet people at professional parties to say, I am a college professor, or I'm a marketing professional, I engage, I'm an advertising executive or whatever, are things that we want, these psychic goods, that are things that we can't touch or quantify, but they're important parts of the workplace for most of us, and the things that we look for in coming up with why it is that we go to work. So the conventional views of work are largely negative. Working by Studs Terkel is a book in which he chronicles this, and he chronicles all of the health issues that American workers have as a result of going to work every day. Ulcers and nervous breakdowns and soft tissue injuries from engaging in repetitive motion kinds of things, right? So the primary view is sort of chronicled by Terkel is this negative view. A second view is this hedonistic view of work, right? That we can get sort of pleasure out of it. But recognizing that not everybody can have that, what are we going to look for in terms of work? Well, the human fulfillment model says that people can build their highest potential at work, right? So this is the opposite of that sort of classical view of work, that we can be creative. As I've said to you, I find this profession to be enormously creative. Coming up with and thinking about the ways in which I can communicate the information that you need to go out into the world and be successful, and use this stuff, like this stuff that is very abstract in ethics. How can I make that relevant to you and allow you to use this in ways that will benefit you in the workplace and develop this human fulfillment model, right? Well, one of the things that I think that this class does is it allows you to think really critically about everything. And when you go out into the workforce, that is going to serve you well in your ability to be creative and develop solutions for your employers that will provide value to the firms that you go to work for, right? It's a character building experience. Thinking about these ideas is really hard, and it builds character, right? So you can go out and find these jobs which provide you with an enormous amount of meaning, right? But not everybody's going to be able to do that. Not everyone is going to be able to have that kind of interesting work. And being a marketer is really interesting. You will get to work on interesting projects that are creative and solve problems for companies. The selling process, if you go into sales, is creative. It's dynamic. You have to think about how you're going to make your products relevant. And that's enormously sort of subjective. And understanding people and being able to read them is enormously difficult and complex. And good salespeople are good at this, right? We're not all going to have that experience. So to the extent that we have to have people like my constituent that worked for the city in the trash collection department and waste, what we now call waste management, we try to do things to make things sound more pleasant than they are. We no longer call them garbage men. We call them waste management, experts, or industrial, waste management engineers, something like that. Sounds more prestigious than you know, trash collector, right? But somebody's gonna have to do that job. It's a necessary job. We have to have this done. I told my city manager, we had this individual who, she's got health issues and they pick up her trash and they're supposed to actually, this is the one instance where the driver is supposed to actually get out of the truck and go get her trash because she has a disability. We offer a service. We have to provide reasonable accommodations for people with disabilities. And so they're supposed to actually go up to her door and get the trash from her and bring it down to the curb and then, you know, get in the truck and do this. Well, apparently they keep forgetting to do it. And she has screamed at them and called and she's cussed the Waste Connections. And they just told her that they weren't gonna pick up her trash anymore because she got hostile with their employees. And they said that that was unacceptable. And so the city manager calls me, she's in my ward, and he calls me and says, you know, we're cutting her off from trash services. And I said, you can't do that. And he said, well, why not? She's being hostile and aggressive and stuff like that. And I said, Eddie, we can't do that. Why not? Well, because if her trash doesn't get picked up, it creates a health hazard, not just for her, but everybody else living around her. I mean, if she's piling the trash up in the backyard, what's gonna happen pretty soon this time of year, right? It's already started. Like we went from, we don't go from like winter to spring to summer in Oklahoma. It just goes from winter to summer in Oklahoma. Like it's freezing cold outside and the next day the horrible Bradford pears are blooming in Oklahoma, right? We had one day of spring and then it'll be hot. How many of you have already had to turn on your air conditioner? I've had to turn on my air conditioner, right? So we've all had to turn on our air conditioner in the lovely Oklahoma heat that's already started. So we can have all 4 seasons actually in one day in Oklahoma. It can start out freezing in the morning and by, you know, mid-morning, it's a lovely 70 degrees. And by 5 o'clock, it can be 89 degrees and hot. So I said, you know, like Eddie, the flies will start gathering. If the trash is being piled up outside her house and nobody's picking it up, we're gonna have a fly problem. That's gonna lead to, you know, other issues and other bugs. And you're gonna have, we have a river or creek that runs through Guthrie. You're gonna have animals coming up from the creek that are scavenging raccoons and skunks and things like that. Those animals can potentially have rabies. You're now encouraging them to come into the city limits. Like, no, call Waste Connections back. And he said they won't do it. And I said, tell Waste Connections we'll fire them if they don't do this. That we will find another trash collection service because the trash has to be picked up. In spite of the fact that this is not a pleasant task for who, I mean, it has to be done. So we have you all who are going to have this opportunity to engage in creative and dynamic and fulfilling work, but somebody still has to do this. So how do we come up with this synthesis model? Well, Norman Bowie talks about it. And it's largely based on this idea of human autonomy. What do we mean by human autonomy? By allowing people the ability to make choices. Not everybody wants to have a creative job experience, right? I can remember one of my administrative assistants here. We had a vice president. When I was in administration here, I worked in the Office of the Legal Counsel. I was an attorney in the Office of Legal Counsel. And we had this administrative assistant who our boss kept coming in. He had a PhD. He was the vice president of administration and finance. And he kept wanting everybody to have these stretch goals. And he was like, what is Judy doing to stretch to be better? And she was like, I don't want to do that. She's like, I like my job the way I like coming here, doing my job, answering. I mean, like, what is it that an administrative assistant does? She answered the phone. She made appointments for us. She scheduled stuff. She filed. Lawyers have lots of files, so there was lots of filing. That's what she wanted to do. She didn't want a creative job.
she wanted to come in and do her job, and she kept saying, why does he want, I'm like, well, we're a university. This is kind of what we do here. And she's like, I don't want to do that. I just want to do my job and go home at 5 o'clock and not think about it anymore, right? So it's about allowing people to make these free choices, having this ability to control their destiny. How do we do that? How do we respect employees? How do we do that? Well, one way we do it is through encouraging, even in jobs that are not terribly creative, encouraging the ability to have input and say. Workplace democracy and due process. How do we come up with workplace democracy and due process? What does that mean to have workplace democracy? What does it mean if I talk about workplace democracy? What does that mean to you? What kinds of things represent democratic values in the United States, and how can we employ that in the workplace? How many of you have had American National? You should have had American National Government by now, right? How many of you had American National Government? Everybody in here has had American National Government? So what does it mean? They tell you, which is kind of a myth, even at the college level, they tell you that we have a democracy. Do we have a democracy in the United States? Do we have a democracy in the United States?
Maybe the illusion of a democracy.
We have an illusion of a democracy. Why do you think we have the illusion of democracy?
I don't know all that much about it. I just know that we as citizens have the right to vote, but then
Okay.
ultimately it comes down to the electoral college.
Okay, yeah, that's an example of how we're not terribly democratic. In more democratic countries, I talked about the United Kingdom, and I said, for example, that you'll never achieve upper class status in the United Kingdom, no matter how hard you work. It doesn't matter how creative you are, how brilliant you are. One of the wealthiest performers in the world is Sir Elton John. He has been knighted for his service to the United Kingdom in terms of his artistic performance, but he's still he's never going to be a duke, never going to be elevated. Those are titles that are passed down from father to son. Never going to be a member of that class of person, right? But having said that, with regard to their actual workings of government, in some respects, they're more democratic than the United States, in that everybody votes for members of parliament. All the members of the House of Commons represent the same number of people. And when you vote for that, you know which party is going to be ultimately in power. When people go out and they vote for their member of parliament, it's absolutely fair. And they know if this party wins, who is going to be president of the United States. You can go out, and this has happened multiple times throughout the history of the United States, 4 to be exact, right? 4 times, 2 times very recently, that people have gone out, they voted for president, and the person who won the popular vote didn't become president, right? When has this happened recently? Anybody remember? Most recent example of somebody not being elected popularly and winning the presidency?
2016.
It was the first Trump administration, right? The first Trump administration. He didn't win the popular vote. Who won the popular vote? You got Hillary Clinton won the popular vote. By how much? Do you know? Not a trivial amount.
Not sure.
5 million votes. She got 5 million more votes. I think. Something like that. That's a lot of votes, isn't it? 5 million? That's a lot of votes. And she didn't win the Electoral College, so she didn't become president. You can win the Electoral College with 10 states in the US and become president. Does that seem terribly democratic? How do you win the Electoral College? Well, how do we get electors? Anybody remember this from American national government?
Isn't it based on
It's
population?
based on population and representation in the United States Senate. So every state has 2 senators, right? And every state has a certain number of representatives. So you combine representatives represent people, senators represent states. You combine those 2, and that gives you the total number of electoral votes that a state has in the Electoral College. And in most states, so the states determine how they're going to apportion their electors. And in all but a couple of states, it's a winner-take-all system. Which means that if you win the plurality of the popular vote in that state on election day, and the formula for election day is it's the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November. That's the formula to determine when we hold presidential elections. Every 4 years, in even numbered years, it's the first Tuesday after the first Monday. So you could have technically, if the first Tuesday is the first of the month, it would be the second Tuesday that you would have the election, right? And in most states, so if you have 3 people running, which we've had multiple times, like Ross Perot ran against George Herbert Walker Bush and Bill Clinton, and it ultimately, his votes pulled enough away from Bush that Clinton became the president, even though he didn't win a majority of the votes, he won a plurality of the vote in the majority of states. You know, most states, it's a winner take all. So if you get the plurality of the vote in that state, you take all of the electors in the state, with very few exceptions. Maine allows for a split in electors. I think one other state allows for a split. You take all of them. So you can win the Electoral College with 10 states. Is that democratic? Doesn't seem very democratic to me. Senators don't represent people, senators represent states, which means that states like Montana have how many senators? 2, the same that we have in Oklahoma. How many people live in Montana? Less than live in the Oklahoma City metropolitan area. Right? I think the state of Montana has something like 1 million people. Oklahoma City has more people, and yet they have 2 senators, right? So the Senate represents states, not people. Is that democratic? In order to pass the United States Senate, how many votes do you have to have? So there are 50 states, which means there are 100 senators. And if you had a majority rule in the United States Senate, you would need 51 senators to pass something, but that's not how many it takes to pass something in the United States Senate. How many does it take? Anybody know? 60. Takes 60. That means a minority of the United States Senate can frustrate the majority, the will of the majority. Not that the Senate even represents the majority. 65% of the Senate represents 40% of the population of the United States, or less. Only in the United States House of Representatives do we have a democracy. one half of one branch of government is Democratic. Because the third branch of government, the courts, which is found in Article 3 of the United States Constitution, are appointed, and they are appointed for life. Judges are appointed for life. Once you become a federal judge, that's it. You hold your office until you die, if you want. Now, most of them retire before then. But once you're appointed, you hold that job for as long as you want. Technically, it's called a term of good behavior, which means that they could be impeached and removed. How many of them have ever been impeached and removed? Almost none. No members of the United States Supreme Court have ever been impeached and removed. There have been a handful of appellate court and district court judges that have been impeached and removed. So not terribly democratic, but what do we want? Well, we want votes, right? If we're going to say we have democracy. So if we apply that to the workplace, what does that mean? Well, it means that we would allow people to work, to vote in the workplace. Now, why do companies not do this? We actually do that here at UCO. We have what's called shared governance, which means that the president has to share power with the faculty. Can the president fire me? I'm a tenured faculty member. Can the president fire me? No. Can't. Who hires and fires faculty at the University of Central Oklahoma? It's not the president. It's not the dean. It's not the vice president for administration. It's the Board of Regents of Oklahoma Colleges, which call themselves Rousseau. They've decided to rename themselves. We actually have workplace democracy here. Most places don't, though. Why? It's inefficient, isn't it? Democracy, and we don't have really a democracy. We have a Republican form of government, and that's small r, Republican form of government. What does that mean? It means we have a Republican form of government in the Machiavellian sense. If we read Machiavelli's discourses on the first 12 books of Titus Livy, he talks about what a Republican form of government is. What is a Republican form of government? It's one that embodies elements of monarchy, elements of aristocracy, and elements of democracy. That's a Republican form of government, and that's what we have. We have a strong executive in the president, which is an element. This is based on the sort of Roman Republican model. So the Roman Republic had consuls, which were two people that embodied the monarchical element in the Roman Republic. They had an aristocracy, which was made up of the Roman Senate, and then they had tribunes, which were elected popularly by the populace. So they had these three elements, right? So we have that. That's not a terribly efficient form of government. What's the most efficient form of government? And by extension, what's the most efficient form of hierarchy in business? Well, it's a dictatorship. Dictatorships are horribly efficient. You don't want to live in one, but they're horribly efficient. Why are they efficient? Because if I'm the dictator, I say this is what the law is, and the law is carried out. Right? It's very efficient. I say what the law is, one person makes the decision, and the law is carried out. Now, that allows for an enormous amount of concentration of power, right? And the abuse of power. Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And so, you have these problems. Now, what's an advantage of democracy? It's not efficient, but we believe that maybe it produces better results because you allow people to have input into the way the government is organized and what we choose to be as law. If we extend that to businesses that engage in some form of workplace democracy, not an absolute, like, let's all sit around and vote, but allowing employees to have input and say, having ethics hotlines, for example, where you actually listen to complaints, which is required by Sarbanes-Oxley, allows for maybe a better input, right? What is it that generates a lot of ideas in business? Well, in big businesses particularly, you can get an enormous amount of ideas from your sales force, who are actually out there listening to customers and knowing what customers want, as opposed to a top-down sort of system. I used to have a company where we did product testing, and my partner in that was another academic, and we did product testing for a company that was based here in Oklahoma City, very well-known company. And the CEO, we would do all this product testing, and he'd say, you know what, I think margarita cherry slush. And we would be like, we didn't test that. Why do you think that would be like a good product? Because I like margarita cherry slushes. And it's like, you're not the demographic of the population that we serve, right? Why would you think that's a good idea? Your sales force actually listens to what people want, right? That they need. And so maybe allowing for those kinds of things is a way of increasing your benefit. Now, it's not necessarily efficient, right? It's more efficient for me to decide as this president and CEO of the company, this is what we're going to do. But ultimately, if you don't listen to what your sales force says and what consumers are demanding, you'll go out of business. And lots of businesses have. Lots of big businesses have failed because they've become myopic and not listened to what the demand is in the general population. They've not listened to their employees necessarily. So one of the things that we can do is if we focus on rights of employees and we allow for some form of workplace democracy where we respect autonomy and we have fair wages for fair pay, we respect employees and we provide healthy and safe working environments, and we reward competence, is you have the ability to have companies that are more flexible, more responsive to the market, and ultimately maybe more profitable. That's the end of this. The next week is reserved for you to work on the second exam, which it requires that you do an essay. You may need to cite for that essay. There will be a fact pattern like there was in the first one. So if you have questions about that, but we will not meet next week because it's reserved for your time to work on the essay exam. Any questions? All right, I will see you the week after. Good luck. If you have any questions, you're welcome to text me.